We are delighted this evening to have with us Dr. Lara Harb, Assistant Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. She specializes in classical Arabic literature, focusing on medieval Arabic literary theory. In 2020, Dr. Harb published her first book, titled Arabic Poetics, Aesthetic Experience in Classical Arabic Literature. And her second book project, tentatively titled Mimesis in Classical Arabic Literature, and she was awarded a grant for it, the National Endowment for Humanities grant. She also published articles on the influential 11th century theorist, Abd al-Qahir al-Jurjani. Dr. Harb is a member of the editorial board of the Library of Arabic Literature at New York University in Abu Dhabi. I will hand it to Dr. Lara Harb. Please keep your question until the end. And you can feel free to write them in the chat and I'll keep track of them. Hello.
Thank you, Abir, for this introduction and for the invitation. And I'd also like to thank the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center for this invitation. And thank you all for attending and giving me the opportunity to talk to you about my book entitled Arabic Poetics, Aesthetic Experience in Classical Arabic Literature, which came out exactly a year ago in the middle of the pandemic. So it's been a very strange year to have, not to mention my first book come out. So it's been a unique experience. But on the other hand, I'm getting the opportunity to talk to so many people over Zoom. So the book, the book talks about, looks at classical Arabic literary criticism and works on eloquence, yani balagha. And in it, I try to determine how these medieval critics and theorists tried to evaluate, how they evaluated poetry. So how did they determine poetic beauty? What criteria did they use when they made judgments about poetic beauty? And in sum, and I'll give you the answer straight off the bat, I argue that wonder was the main criterion by which medieval critics judged poetic beauty. That is, the ability of a poetic statement to evoke wonder in the listener. And this is at least in post-10th century Arabic literary theory. I'll try to show you what I mean by this in my talk today through a selection of poetic examples. But first, I'll give you an overview of the corpus I worked with. So I'm going to share my slide, my screen. So we have numerous treatises in Arabic that have come down to us from the 9th century, Common Era, so 3rd century after Islam, and onwards, that deal with poetics and eloquence. Beyond the many that are published in modern editions that are easily accessible, also online in PDF form, there remain many that are still waiting to be discovered in libraries around the world. But in general, these theories of the literary or the poetic in this corpus were expressed in 4 different types of discourse, motivated by 4 different concerns. Poetry, philosophy, something I call elucidation, which is bayan in Arabic, or signification, and the Quran. Each one of these approaches ends up focusing on a particular aspect or particular aspects of language. So, for example, the poetic approach focuses on rhetorical figures, badia figures. The philosophical approach focuses primarily on the figures of simile and metaphor. The idea of elucidation I should mention, the philosophical approach is mainly spurred by the translation of Aristotle's Poetics in the 10th century, and they understand it as part of logic, Aristotle's books on logic. So that's why philosophers like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd were concerned with questions of poetics, but they have a unique approach and unique terminology as well. The third approach is what I call elucidation or bayan. These are texts concerned with eloquence in general, whether in poetry or prose, and they're concerned particularly with how language communicates meaning and what makes one form of communication more eloquent than another. So their approach can be described as a semiotic approach to language. So in other words, they were concerned with how words signify their meaning, and then how words signify meanings beyond their literal meaning, figuratively. Hence, we can describe it as a semiotic approach to language. An example of this is, for example, Al-Jahid's Al-Bayan wa Tabyin, if you're familiar with the classical texts. Finally, the fourth motivator that spurred inquiry into linguistic beauty was the Quran. And this Quranic approach was concerned with illustrating the inimitability of the Quran, i'jaz al-Quran. And they end up focusing, instead of rhetorical figures, and a little bit on simile and metaphor, but really their main concern was nazm, which means sentence construction. So they focus on what makes sentence construction, and that's where they believed the inimitability of the Quran lies. They theorized what about sentence construction makes one way of saying something more beautiful than another. So in the book, I look at all four of these types of criticism. And although they are very different in their concerns and methods of argumentation, I show that they share a common assumption about what constitutes poeticity. So at least from the 10th century onwards. And I argue that the poetic is defined by a statement's ability to evoke wonder in the listener. In other words, the primary aesthetic experience expected to result from poetry or poetic prose or the Quran is an experience of awe and wonder. Now, what do I mean by wonder? The actual psychological experience of wonder is difficult to describe. So we often have to go back to memories of childhood to reimagine what the experience is like the experience of being in awe of the world and everything being new and open to discovery. And this is because in childhood, we're learning about the world for the very first time. Everything is new and unknown to a child. Nothing is yet too familiar. However, while it might be difficult to describe what wonder is as a feeling, we know what kinds of things bring it about. So in some, it results from being confronted with the unfamiliar, the inexplicable, the mysterious, the unexpected, the rare, the novel, the strange. But the story doesn't end there. So there's another important side to wonder. The curiosity that these unfamiliar, rare, and inexplicable things arouse in us leads to the desire to uncover the mystery, to understand and to discover. So wonder has this two-sidedness to it. It results from a state of not knowing or ignorance, but it's a kind of ignorance that challenges us to dispel it, as one scholar has described it. And this is why, going back all the way to the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and also Plato famously declare that it is due to wonder that philosophers began to philosophize, that man began to philosophize. So it's this desire, wonder is not just the result of our confrontation with the unknown, but it's also the subsequent discovery of what it is, of what the subsequent making the unknown known. That's also an important aspect of wonder. Philip Fisher describes this moment of discovery as the moment when the puzzling snaps into sharp focus and is grasped with pleasure. So one may experience wonder at extraordinary things that purportedly exist in the world, such as perhaps these marvelous trees on the mysterious island of Wak Wak, which bear humans as fruit, described in medieval Arabic works on the marvels and wonders of the world. In fact, such encyclopedic works, which are sometimes classified by modern scholars as a genre of ajaib or marvels, were often motivated by a sense of religious duty to marvel at God's creations, however big or small they may be. The 14th century author Zakaria al-Qazwini, who wrote one of the most prominent examples of this genre entitled The Wonders of Creation, Ajaib al-Makhluqat, exclaims that the world is filled with wonders. The only reason we're not constantly in awe is that wonder fades as a result of familiarity and frequent observation. Familiarity, though, can be defamiliarized through language. So language can reproduce an experience of discovery and wonder through artificially creating the conditions that lead to wonder. That is, language can produce strangeness, unexpectedness, novelty, rarity, unclarity, only for these matters to be discovered anew. And indeed, this is what post-10th century classical Arabic literary criticism was founded upon. Medieval scholars developed sophisticated theories about what produces these conditions in language, which explain the resulting impact on the listener upon confronting them. One of the main medieval scholars I look at in the book, and who really builds the foundations for this theory of wonder, is the 11th century grammarian and literary theorist from Gorgan, which is a region close to the Caspian Sea, which is today in Iran, by the name of Abd al-Qahir al-Jurjani. So Jurjani wrote two very important books, Asrar al-Balagha, The Secrets of Eloquence, and Dala'il al-Ajaz, so the signs of the inimitability of the Quran. Jurjani most elaborately develops this theory of wonder in his discussion of simile or tashbih in his book on the secrets of eloquence. And he makes several general observations about human nature and the pleasures of discovery. So he states, the pleasure of the soul is based on being lifted from the hidden to the visible, being presented with the plain after the enigmatic, being moved from the known to the better or more intimately known. So I describe this observation as an observation about as a principle of discovery. He's basically describing the joy one feels upon discovering something, upon being lifted from the hidden to the visible. Jurjani goes on to describe another principle about human nature and the pleasure of discovery that has to do with the effort it takes to move from the hidden to the visible, stating, it is human nature that if something is gained after searching, effort, and yearning, its attainment is more beautiful and pleasurable. Thus, the more one has to work to get to the meaning, the more pleasurable is the result. So we have two principles. Discovery is pleasurable, like going through this experience of discovering something is pleasurable, and the more effort is required to discover, the better. Giorgiani applies these principles to analyze what is beautiful about simile, tashbih. So on one level, simile, when you compare something to something else, is beautiful by definition, because a comparison, by definition, requires one to search for the reason the two things are compared and to seek the point of similarity. And thus, the information is not given to you in a straightforward way. You have to search for the intention of the poet and discover the meaning. So, inherent in a simile, you have this process of discovery. And a beautiful simile doesn't make this process obvious. But Giorgiani delineates several ways in which a simile can be made even less straightforward. And these can be summarized by these three ideas: the distance formula, details, and the rarity. So with regard to the distance formula, he basically, he says, the further the two things compared are, and the less likely for there to be a similarity between them, the more rewarding is the discovery of a similarity despite this acute difference. Thus, if we consider the following verse by Ibn al-Mu'taz, who is a 9th century Abbasid poet, and he famously was a caliph for one day. He explains, he compares in it the narcissus flower to vessels or containers made out of mother of pearl filled with carnelian. Carnelian is this reddish, orangey gem stone. So he states كأن عيون النرجس الغض حولنا مداهن در حشوهن عقيق. So he's comparing again the flower to something that is similar to it in color. Giorgiani asks us to compare this verse to another one, which is also sometimes attributed to Ibn al-Mu'taz, but also to Ibn al-Rumi and others as well. We're not sure. In these verses, violets in front of red hyacinths are compared to a flame. So I'll read it in Arabic. ولا زوردية تزهو بزرقتها بين الرياض على حمر اليواقيت كأنها فوق قامات ضعفن بها أوائل النار في أطراف كبريت. So he argues that, can you guess which one is better? So he makes a comparison between these two verses. One, the violets in front of red hyacinths are compared to the beginnings of fire at the edges of sulfur. I tried to help you imagine the image with these pictures I found online. But there's this image versus the image previously that compares Narcissus to a pearl container, mother of pearl container with carnelian gemstones inside it. So Giorgiani argues that this verse, the violets verse, is more beautiful. The reason is because it's an unusual comparison. So it compares two things that are quite different from each other: tender, moist flowers and a flame of fire. You wouldn't expect there to be a similarity between such things, he says. And then this unexpectedness of the similarity in turn is what evokes wonder, what evokes the pleasure of discovery in the listener, as opposed to the other verse, which simply compares the narcissus to gemstones based on the similarity in color. That's a much more expected comparison, according to Giorgiani. So the least of, based on this logic, the least obvious and hence best comparisons are those that find similarity in opposites, and such as, for example, the following verse, in which the poet sees the beloved as at once present and absent. أيا غائبا حاضرا في الفؤاد سلام على الحاضر الغائب. So it is this combination of opposites that of someone who is present and absent at once that requires us to pause and understand the meaning. How could someone be present and absent at once? Another a way of making a simile less straightforward, according to Giorgiani, is adding details. Here again, he asks us to compare two verses, in this case by two famous pre-Islamic poets, in which a sword or a spear is compared to a flame. So in the first one, Antar ibn Shaddad says, يتابع لا يبتغي غيره بأبيض يعني بسيف أبيض بأبيض كالقبس الملتهب. So he's comparing here his white sword to a blazing flame. This is a pretty standard, common simile in classical Arabic literature. Umru al-Qais's take on it, where he's talking about his spear, his Rudaini spear. He says, جمعت ردينيا كأن سنانه سنا لهب لم يتصل بدخاني. So here he compares his spear to a flame, a blaze of flame, untouched by smoke. Again, can you guess which one is preferable to Giorgiani? It's the second verse, Umru al-Qais's verse, in which he compares the spear to a flame untouched by smoke. سَنَ لَهَبٍ لَمْ يَتَّصِلْ بِدُخَانِ. He says this is more beautiful than Antara's comparison of simply أبيض كالقبس الملتهب, so like a blazing flame, because Umru al-Qais's comparison has this added detail that it is a flame that is untouched by smoke. لم يتصل بدخانه. One is forced to stop and ponder why the added detail, why limit the simile to the flames alone without the smoke. And this added effort to grasping the comparison enhances the pleasures of discovering the meaning. And here, in this regard, Giorgiani makes one of my favorites of his observations, where he states, the more deeply an image goes into details, the more one needs to stop, remember, contemplate, and slow down. I think it's such a beautiful description of what poetry does or should do. It's an attempt at slowing you down, making you think, making you contemplate. The third way of making you slow down, making a simile less straightforward, is rarity, according to Giorgiani. Rarity, although one might expect, rarity is such a culturally dependent thing. It's a culturally specific thing. I mean, it's hard to imagine, what was rare in 11th century Iran? Can we have access to this information or not? But actually, Jurjani does give us a sense of what he means by a rare comparison. So in one example, Jurjani cites this verse by Dhurrumma, in which the poet compares the complexion of a beautiful woman to silver with a touch of gold. So he states, Dhurrumma states, كحلاء في برج صفراء في نهج كأنها فضة قد مسها ذهب. So in another verse, the poet compares, and he's considering these two verses from the aspect of rarity. In another verse, he cites by Abu Talib al-Raqi, the poet compares the shining stars to pearls strewn on a blue carpet. It goes as follows: وَكَأَنَّ أَجْرَامَ النُّجُومِ لَوَامِعًا دُرَرٌ نُثِرْنَا عَلَى بِسَاطٍ أَزْرَقِ. Jurjani argues that this. I should ask you now. I guess you've gotten a hang of it. It's the second one always that is better, that is more beautiful, the way I'm presenting these. But yes, so Jurjani argues that the second is a rarer comparison and therefore a more beautiful comparison. And the reason is because the thing that it's compared to, the pearls strewn on a blue carpet, is something that one observes less frequently, if ever, than the first image, which is silver mixed with gold. Because he states, and I quote, people always see works of silver decorated with gold, while it might never come about that they see pearls strewn on a blue carpet. So even though it's not a difficult image to imagine, but it is an image that one wouldn't experience necessarily in life very often, if ever. So we're forced to dig deeper in our memory and imagination in order to grasp the image. So that makes it a rarer image and therefore a more beautiful image. So Jurjani has a huge influence on the trajectory of classical Arabic literary theory. His ideas shape what later becomes formalized as the science of eloquence, or علم البلاغة. So there were several attempts at organizing Jurjani's ideas. The first was by Fakhreddin al-Razi in the 12th century, but it was really a Sakkaki in the late 12th, early 13th century in his Miftah al-Ulum, where he really systematizes Jurjani's ideas. And then Al-Khatib al-Qazwini writes a commentary on the section on Ilm al-Balagha in Sakkaki's Miftah al-Ulum. First a short one, Talkhis al-Miftah, and then Al-Idah, which is an expanded explanation of the Talkhis. And these two works really form what we know as Ilm al-Balagha. It becomes a formalized, standardized science. And then we have commentaries on As-Sakkaki and Al-Khatib al-Qazwini up to the 20th century. So this is it's a science that keeps developing, that starts really with Jurjani originally in the 11th century. And these elements that I just went through, that I described as slowing down the grasping of a simile, the distance formula, the details, rarity, become classified and organized in Ilm al-Balagha as strangeness-enhancing elements under their discussion of simile. Simile gets classified. I mean, this is a lot of information if you're not familiar with this, but I'll go over it very quickly. I can discuss it more later, but Ilm al-Balagha gets divided into three branches, each branch focusing on a specific aspect of language. And one of these branches is Ilm al-Bayan, which is the science of elucidation. And that branch focuses on simile, metaphor, and kinaya, and figurative speech, majaz, generally speaking. So, what is interesting about Ilm al-Bayan is that it's concerned with how words reveal meaning. So how do similes reveal meaning through comparison? How do they move one from not knowing to knowing? And what makes these processes of moving from ignorance to knowledge more impactful on the listener than others? Thus, in fact, bayan is often translated in English as clarity. I mean, one of the meanings of bayan is clarity, but in the context of ilm al-bayan, it's actually not really about clarity. That's not what is what the aesthetics of bayan is based on. It's actually about the process of clarifying and elucidating. A process that often requires the poet to purposely obscure and estrange in order for a discovery to take place. So this mechanism of elucidation that describes simile also describes metaphor and figurative speech generally, as well as kinaya, which variously refers to allusion, implied meaning, or metonymy. And it's often for the sake of simplicity, not exactitude, translated as metonymy. But these, along with simile, form the core figures of Ilm al-Bayan. So at the level of signification, a metaphor is by definition a less obvious way of signifying meaning than using words to mean their literal meaning. So again, building on the theories already developed by Jurjani, As-Sakaki and Al-Khatib al-Qazwini argue that one cannot assess a poet's skill in his use of language when used literally. For a particular sound of a particular set of sounds signify what they mean based on convention. It's an arbitrary thing that the word rajul refers to man in Arabic. There's nothing skillful about the poet choosing the word rajul to describe that meaning in a given context, if that's what he intended. It just shows that the poet knows how to has a good lexical knowledge. Instead, where a poet's literary skill shows is in his ability to indirectly point to meaning through metaphor and metonymy. So here again, the stranger this signification is, and the more steps are required to go through to deduce the intended meaning, the better. In other words, the more far-fetched the metaphor or metonymy, the better. And this is, again, precisely because of the principle of effort mentioned by Jurjani. The more effort, the more rewarding the discovery. An example of strangeness in kinaya, where it's often, kinaya often is a description of some symptoms of a situation that lead you to deduce that someone is of a certain character, or deduce something that these symptoms are a consequence of. Anyway, here, I hope this example clarifies. So in this verse, the poet says about himself, وَمَا يَكُ فِيَّ مِنْ عَيْبٍ فَإِنِّي جَبَانُ الْكَلْبِ مَهْزُولُ الْفَصِيلِ. So he says, there's no fault in me. I am one with a cowardly dog, Jabanul Kalb, and an emaciated baby camel, Mahzulul Fasil. What on earth can he mean by this? Kinaya. So they explain, having a cowardly dog and an emaciated baby camel are signs, are symptoms that their owner is a generous person, for his dog is cowardly because he does not bark at oncoming strangers. And that's because the dog is so accustomed to seeing strangers flocking to its owner's house because he's so welcoming and generous. So the dog is so used to having guests that it doesn't even bark. It's cowardly. And that's a sign of his owner's generosity. The fact that he has an emaciated baby camel indicates indirectly that its mother has been slaughtered to feed the guests, thus indicating, again, the length to which the owner is willing to go for the sake of being generous. Such far-fetched images were commended precisely for the number of steps one has to go through in order to grasp their meaning, the discovery of which is all the more wondrous as a result. This kind of far-fetched imagery was not always celebrated by critics, however. In fact, the aesthetic of wonder was not always the dominant aesthetic championed by critics. It only started to develop as far as I can tell, at the turn of the 11th century Common Era. So 5th century Hijri. So, and this is after almost 2 centuries of critical writing in Arabic. Earlier criticism was concerned with different aesthetic criteria, namely the truthfulness and literal accuracy of poetry, as well as its natural simplicity. Much of the debate of what I'm calling the old school of criticism revolved around the new muhdath style of the Abbasid poets, which was held up to the standards of the, by then, idealized classical pre-Islamic poetry. So with the rise of the Abbasid Empire in the mid 2nd Hijri, 8th century CE, a new style of poetry started developing. And to give you a rough sense of the historical context here, for those of you who are not familiar, the Arabic poetic tradition goes back to the 6th or even 5th century CE. This pre-Islamic poetry was dominated by desert imagery and descriptions drawn from the Arabian Bedouin lifestyle and tribal society. And it came to constitute in later centuries the classical heritage of Arabic poetry and represented the ideal model to be sought after by poets. By the time the Abbasids came to power in 750, a variety of factors, such as urbanization, a shift from a tribal to a patron-based culture, the existence of by then an established literary heritage. So the Abbasid poets had to deal with the pre-Islamic poets, had to deal with Imr al-Qais and Antara. They were not writing in a vacuum. This led to new developments and a new environment with new poetic demands. And so, for example, in this verse by Abu Nuwas, who was considered one of the leaders of this new style of poetry, he makes fun of the old and you know, the traditional opening of a classical qasida is to mourn the beloved at or to remember the beloved at the atlal, at the remnants of her encampment after her tribe has departed. Here, Abu Nuwas is pushing for innovation by making fun of this old motif. He says, راح الشقي على الربوع يهيم والراح في راحي ورحت أهيم. So he says the wretch goes on and he's wandering at his beloved's encampment, his atlal, but I instead am wandering with wine in my hand. Obviously, Abu Nuwas is the famous wine poet. Notice here, though, what was new about this verse is not just that he's making fun of conventions of old Arabic poetry or motifs, but also that he's making conscious use of the poetic device of paronomasia, which is tajnis. With his play with rah and rahi and ruhtu. So raha went means he went, ar-rah means wine, rahi means my palm, my hand, ruhtu, I went. So he's playing with this this repetition of sounds, but with different meanings, which is tajnis. It's not that paronomasia or tajnis didn't exist in pre-Islamic poetry, but unlike the old poetry, the new Abbasid style made a conscious effort to use literary figures, such as tajnis, but also metaphor, simile, antithesis, and many, many others that came to be known as badia in medieval Arabic criticism. Due to this increased use of literary figures, this new muhdath style of poetry is often referred to as the badia style. The comparative evaluation of the old and new styles sparked a big debate among critics in the 9th, but especially in the 10th century. While initially pre-Islamic poetry was given precedence simply because it was the original and authentic ideal, the debate eventually shifted to the stylistic differences between the poets writing in the style of the ancients and those composing poetry in the badia style. Nevertheless, the old style remains superior in this old school of criticism. Exemplified by al-Buhturi, the old style was characterized as natural, matbu', close to the truth, familiar, straightforward, and adhering to the conventions of the ancient pre-Islamic poets. The new style, on the other hand, which was exemplified by Abu Tammam, was described as artificial, masnu', for its excessive use of badia, and as being far from the truth, strange and obscure, and was criticized for digressing from convention. In other words, the new style was deemed far-fetched, hyperbolic, excessive in its use of rhetorical figures, affected, while the old style was close to the truth, realistic, natural. The question of truthfulness and naturalness, therefore, framed the discourse about the poetic in the old school of criticism, which ranged then from those who were proponents of truthfulness in poetry and espoused the idea that the best poetry is the most truthful, أحسن الشعر أصدقه, and those who favored falsehood and espoused the idea that the best poetry is the most untruthful, أحسن الشعر أكذبه. However, as I show in chapter 1 in the book, even those who defended the new style did so by arguing that there was nothing new about it, as Ibn al-Mu'taz does in Kitab al-Badi'a, or that its far-fetched imagery was actually truthful and accurate on a literal level, so it wasn't actually so false as people might claim. The theory of wonder, so this was a little bit of a digression to come back to the theory of wonder. So the theory of wonder that starts developing at the end of the 10th, early 11th century represents a major paradigm shift from this earlier framework of thinking. Instead of prioritizing one style over another or defending the value of falsehood in poetry, the new wonder-based school of criticism developed logical explanations for the effect of beautiful speech in general, whether it be in the kinds of elaborate rhetorical figures and fantastic metaphors found in the new style of the Abbasid poetry, or in simple, perfectly constructed similes one might find in pre-Islamic poetry. Okay, so I have a few examples, but I think I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna jump to my conclusion, and if you want to hear more poetry, we can come back to them. Basically, I mean, the gist of what I wanted to show you is some examples of rhetorical figures that became popular in the new style, and how Jurjani explains them by using a different kind of language. So instead of using the language of falsehood and truthfulness, he uses a language that is more akin to wonder. So he talks about trickery and how even tajnis, why tajnis is beautiful is not just because it's a repetition of sound, but it's because it creates an expectation of the repetition of meaning, and you expect that there's nothing new, yet there are new meanings being inserted, even though the sound is the same. Arrahu fi rahi, and so you have to pay more attention, and then you're surprised to discover new meaning. And that's so he's articulating why the language, using rhetorical figures like tajnis, why it produces an aesthetic experience in you. It produces this experience of wonder. And with this, he's really shifting away from this old school of criticism, and which was based on this dichotomous discourse of truth and falsehood, or natural and artificial. Significantly, one thing that is significant about what Giorgiani does is that when he shifts from this discourse, this dichotomous discourse, to a discourse of wonder, he's not only legitimizing the new style. I mean, he's explaining why tajnis is beautiful. There is actually something beautiful about tajnis. It's not just a question of embellishment. But he's legitimizing the new style without dismissing the tradition. So this theory of wonder explains the new, but it also gives a new explanation for the old. Significantly, also, this aesthetic of wonder formed the basis of post-10th century demonstrations of the miraculousness of the Quran, Ijaz al-Quran, where in that case, the indirect effect of syntax on meaning is credited with the inimitable, awe-inspiring nature of the Quran. The Arabic interpretations of Aristotle's Poetics also exhibit an underlying aesthetic of wonder, where poetic reasoning constituted a make-believe kind of logic, which results in discovery and wonder. And again, philosophers are thinking of the Poetics as part of Aristotle's logical sciences. So they're thinking of the Poetic as a kind of syllogism, qiyas, that one has to work through and discover its meaning. So in sum, the theory of wonder, the argument I put forth in the book is that the theory of wonder constituted a comprehensive explanation of linguistic beauty that could be universally applied to old and new poetry, the Quran, and even in logic. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harb. Now we open the floor for questions. Feel free to ask questions verbally or write them in the chat.
I'm happy to go over the other examples I had prepared, but if there's time. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts and comments and questions.
أهلا.
تفضل.
I actually have an interest in medieval literature, particularly in the intersection with Arabic and Spanish, but what kind of resources do you use when studying this particular topic?
So the corpus, as I described it, I mean, is enormous, really, and quite a bit of it is available in published editions, in modern published editions that are quite decent. I mean, editions sometimes have problems, but and a lot of them are available online, which has been, a boon in these COVID times. People upload them in PDFs online, so this material is quite accessible. I mean, this project didn't require me to go into manuscripts or archives and look at manuscripts. And once you get into this field, I mean, there's a pretty clear set of texts that one would need to consider. I didn't look at everything. There's much more than what I looked at. I had to choose, how to limit my research. But but you start, I mean, part of the project was also trying to start making sense of the map and the landscape of all these texts. And this is partly what I've done through this book.
We have a question from, sorry.
Shukran. That's all.
Thank you. We have a question from Michaela. She's asking, who's your favorite poet? At the moment, I'm really interested in Al-Ma'arri, but he's very difficult to read. He's very wonder-evoking once you figure out what he's saying. But you definitely have many moments of discovery when trying to work through his poetry. Another question, can you talk more about this idea of wonder and its influence on contemporary Arabic poetry? Yeah, I cannot talk too much about it. I mean, first of all, because I don't really work on contemporary Arabic poetry myself. I mean, except reading it for pleasure personally, but I cannot claim to talk about it in a scholarly matter. The other thing I mean, there are different ways to approach this question. I mean, there's no doubt that this idea of wonder has some degree of universality to it. So there, not only would it, I feel that it explains, moments of poetry in not only in modern contemporary or contemporary Arabic poetry, but also in poetry in general, in whichever language you're reading. The other thing is this concept of wonder, as far as I know, I mean, hasn't been so explicitly articulated about the classical Arabic tradition as I've done now in this book. And this is partly because the classical Arabic tradition does not explicitly explain that their aesthetic is one of wonder. I had to make a case for it in the book. It's not, and hopefully readers will be convinced by it, but it's something that I had to argue for and show that there is this overarching aesthetic sensibility that defines how they're explaining things. So it required some digging. So I'm curious whether this would have influence on future writing or on future thinking, perhaps in contemporary literary criticism and also poetry. I don't know, but yeah, unfortunately, I cannot give a much better answer. Huda Fakhreddin would be a great person to ask that question to. What about Lauren is asking, what about the expression that says the truth is often stranger, more wondrous than fiction? Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we say that when the truth, I mean, there's certain aspects of the truth there that are leading us to describe it as strange, and it comes from the assumption that we know that truths are known to us, are familiar, and therefore the strangeness is only coming from a fictional place. But in reality, you can find strangeness in truths as well. In a sense, I mean, if we heed Zakaria al-Qazwini's recommendation in his Ajab al-Makhluqat, he wants us to be amazed by everything, even the most mundane thing in the world, because everything is a sign of God's creation. So all truths should be strange and wonder-evoking to us. It's just that we stop paying attention to them because we're so familiar with them. So in a sense, all truth should be strange, but we have to make an effort in our attitude towards them, towards truth, to see that strangeness.
So we have a question from Sinan. Is the criteria exclusively applicable to Arabic language?
No, not at all. And I think, again, this hopefully will open doors for new research in other fields and other languages, but very directly, Arabic literary theory and Arabic literature influenced neighboring literatures in the Islamic world, including medieval Hebrew literature and Persian literature, and then eventually Ottoman and Urdu, going to later centuries. And the aesthetics in those literatures are very similar. The poetry in those literatures are very similar, have a very similar aesthetic to the Arabic. I mean, there are differences obviously as well. The literary theory in those languages also is following the model of the Arabic. But this would require more research, and hopefully people who work with these languages to look into whether there are similarities. But there are also similarities with modern Western theories, especially theories forged by a school called the Russian formalism. And they have theories about strangeness of language, and that's one of the defining features of what makes language poetic, that are very similar to what we see in Jurjani and Ilm al-Balagha. So I do think, I mean, some aspects are very specific to the Arabic language when they talk about syntax, but the principles are, I believe, universal and can be applied to other languages.
And we have a long question from Jeffrey. Would you say that the medieval classical poetry became more sophisticated than the pre-Islamic poetry, or would you say that the medieval poetry was in a great sense imitative of both pre-Islamic element and combined with Quranic style? And also considering those four elements you mentioned of poetry, philosophy, bayan, and Quran.
So, I mean, when you say something is more sophisticated than another, you're making a judgment that is based on certain criteria. And this is what the old school of criticism did. And they privileged pre-Islamic poetry in that case. What I think with this aesthetic of wonder that develops, what is so unique about it is that it describes the beauty of language in general. It gives general principles, regardless of whether it's pre-Islamic or New Style. In fact, many of the examples that they provide are pre-Islamic or old poetry. So, in order to illustrate this aesthetic of wonder. So I wouldn't say at all that one is more sophisticated than the other. There's pre-Islamic poetry that is also extremely wonder-evoking, and but they achieve that in different ways. But of course, I think that the Quran, again, the Quran, but also the fact that there was a heritage, a literary heritage that the Abbasid poets had to contend with. I mean, those things inevitably influenced how poetry developed. They couldn't keep on writing and composing poetry the way pre-Islamic poets did. After the fact that pre-Islamic poetry already was an established heritage and you had new things coming into the language like the Quranic style.
We have a request. Could you please share your presentation and a link to purchase your book with SQCC? This presentation will be posted on YouTube, but we can share a link to purchase if, yeah, of course.
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, the book is quite expensive, but it's with Cambridge University Press. There might be a discount if you write them. They might be able to give you a discount. But the introduction is available for free to download online. So if anyone is interested to start out with.
Great. Question from Lauren. Is the shift from truth to wonder also a form of escapism?
Interesting. I would have to think about that. Possibly. But the shift from truth to wonder does not necessarily remove truth. I mean, you can still have wonder that results from truth and truthful statements that are, you know, literal. There are ways of achieving that. You don't have to use this fantastic imagery that the new style of poetry, muhdath poetry, uses. It's not the only way of producing wonder. So they're not mutually exclusive, in other words. However, some of these linguistic games, I mean, do distract you from the actual matter. It becomes, I mean, the aesthetic experience does become about just the play, the games within the language, and not necessarily about what the final meaning is in the end. So in that sense, maybe it is a form of escapism, but it is a form of escapism that requires a lot of mental work. As opposed to maybe today, you know, our forms of escapism is very passive reception of TV, and so yeah, it's something to think about, but it's not a straightforward answer.
This is our final question from Luke. Did Giorgiani criteria affect how Sufi poetry was composed and evaluated by critics?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for some reason, the critics, the literary critics, do not deal with Sufi poetry and Sufi imagery at all. This doesn't mean that Sufi poetry isn't using these techniques to enhance the effect of their poetry. But I think when you come to Sufi poetry, it becomes that's a whole other world where language is a means to get at a greater truth, and it's not just a linguistic play. And for that, I mean, there are theories that are developed like by people like Ibn al-Arabi, which are very complex but have to do with theology, and I think it's still not clear to me how, if at all, wonder per se, this aesthetic of wonder, fits with Sufi poetry. But it's an interesting question that I hope also is explored in the future. If there are graduate students in the audience, I mean, these are all great questions to pursue.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for this evening. I would like to thank Dr. Lara Harb for a great presentation, and it was our pleasure to have her with us this evening. And I would like to thank our attendees for making it to this event.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.